So hello, my name's Alex. I'm in a band called Easy Rollers, but before I was in Easy Rollers I was in a band called Hyperon Experience. We made UK hardcore from 91, well we released from 91 up until 94, and from 94 onwards I just did Easy Rollers. So how do you do? So how did I first get into music? Well, there was a moment I experienced when I lived with my parents in West Wickham High Street. We lived above their shop. I was lying on the floor in the lounge and something came on the television. It was a group called Tick and Tock, and they were performing a track called Cool Running, and they were doing robot dancing to electro beats. And this was brand new to me. I'd never seen it. I'd never seen any of that New York thing or anything. And I saw that and I just thought, well, that's it. That's it. That's what you do. You do rap, beatbox, breakdancing, graffiti, and you make music. That's what you do. And that's what I decided I would do. The only other music I really experienced was the music that my elder sister played, and she played a lot of the sort of early 80s sounds of Depeche Mode, but mostly an album that she played over and over again was Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon. I mean, this was on practically repeat, and because of the shape of the house, it was like you could always hear it wherever you were. So I pretty much spent most of while I was trying to roll around on bits of lino in the high street, I was also being bombarded by my eldest sister's Pink Floyd tunes, which obviously I realise to today are exceptional music. So my first experimentation with sound was using a computer that my mother had bought me for Christmas. It was a Commodore VIC-20, which wasn't very good, but it was great because it was basic, and I was learning basic at school, so this was all good. Somehow I managed to program a sequencer, and I hadn't actually sorted out how to make it loop from an input, but what I had done was made some small envelope-shaped percussive sounds, and then I had a simple counting system between keystrokes, which then would play them back. So I couldn't quite make it loop, but I could get it to replicate what I had put in a very approximate way. And although I programmed this and set it up and did it, and only used it once when I realised the limitations of my ability to make it loop, I did discover then what it was, some of the things that I needed to do. When I first moved up to Beccles when I was 14, I hooked up with some lads. See, this was at the end of hip hop, when hip hop was kind of going out of flavour. Really, it had been around in England for a few years, and these chaps that I met up with, one of which was Jay, the other Easy Roller, another one was Danny, another guy called Kevin, and someone called Andrew, and a guy called Jerry Dye, and we started going to these parties. Back in 1986, there was just this sound of this 4/4 beats with these kind of simple bass lines. It was all very repetitive. It was very different because at the time most of the music in the discos was pretty much dictated by the charts, and in particular Stott Aitken and Waterman. That was that sound. And then this sound came along, and it was something different. It was the way they used technology, and it was a simplistic raw style. They used vocals. Some of the vocals were out of key, badly mixed, not arranged correctly. The samples were used, the vocal samples were triggered like Art of Noise did, or Paul Hardcastle, and they sounded like drum beats. Vocals used as drum beats. It was something different. It wasn't something I'd fully heard in hip hop, but it seemed to build on it, and that really interested me. It really interested me because that was what people were dancing to. Whereas hip hop wasn't so much of a dancing thing. To me it was a battle thing. When I went to hip hop nights, it was to battle, not to dance. Although that was it. But no, the house thing, the house sound interested me, and I started making it. So how did I start making music? Well, obviously I experimented with different sounds, trying to do things. I was running really appalling microphones through really appalling tape decks. But for a while, after I moved up here, I moved back out to Spain. My parents lived, this is going to sound terribly middle class, but they had a yacht in the Mediterranean, and I lived on that while they lived in an apartment. And somewhere along the line I got hold of a Casio SK5 sampling keyboard, which was an incredible machine because it was a sampling, which I didn't have, and it had a drum machine, and it had a 3-track rudimentary sequencer. And I'd experimented a bit, and eventually I'd managed to run these preset house beats along with a bass line, which was basically a copy of an old Chicago house bass line. And on top of that, I was triggering a sample like I'd heard from the house beats, but triggering like drum machines. And there was this moment when the whole thing came together. There was the beats, there was the bass line, there was this hook line, this melody. It was a moment, an absolute moment, which cut through my stomach like a knife. And I was like, this is how you make music. This is how you do it. You do this. And I knew from that moment what I wanted to do and how I was going to go about doing it. I had the tools necessary. I needed a sequencer, I needed a drum machine, I needed a sampler. This was how I was doing. And this all happened when I was sitting next to my mother. And when I had this absolute epiphany, I had running through this stereo super quiet so I could just hear it while my mother was reading a book. And I had this moment, like, almost like a calling from a God, you know, this is what I want to do. And I turned to my mother and I said, while these beats were happening, I said, what do you think of this? What do you think of this? She shut her book and she quietly said, that's the worst sound I've ever heard in my life. Poetry. Well, the first album I made was a hodgepodge of ideas. It was done on an Amiga. The Amiga had a broken MIDI port, which was an external device anyway. The software I had was cracked, only worked at 14 kilohertz, 8-bit, was 8-track, all notes had to be entered in musical notation, and so it was very basic. I also had a Casio RZ1 drum machine which had 4 sample pads, each pad was at 0.2 of a second. And I'd done this album. This album really was an experimentation of what was possible with this equipment, and although I had many melodies that were good, the production was appalling. It was basically what can be done with these sounds rather than, okay, now how do I mix these sounds into anything? There was no EQ in this computer. I had no desk. It was basically the sounds as they were, whacked together and made into tunes by an inexperienced person. Obviously I was chuffed as buttons that I'd done this album, and I took it all around London to the shops and the record shops to play it to people, and it wasn't good. I've actually listened to it recently and it's appalling. And I can imagine these poor people with this skinny, enthusiastic kid turning up going, man, this is my tape, can you hear it? And this guy put the tape on in the shop and he heard the first tune, started fast forwarding it, heard the second tune, started fast forwarding it, dealt with a customer, forgot about my tune fast forwarding, pressed play, had a listen, decided he didn't like it, and that was it. That was my first experience of A&R and people criticising my own music, and it was very negative, really put me back. I understand now why that was, because it's amateurish, immature, unmixed, unprocessed. We would laugh at it now. But to me it meant everything, and obviously when you've gone up to that point it was a bit of a knockback. But you know, it didn't stop me, it just knocked me back. Coming back from that experience was simple because I'd already made up my mind that I wanted to make music and this is what I was going to do, so it's something that I just continued to do. I mean, ultimately I hooked up with Danny and we did the Hyperon and then the Jay, so that was a step on from that. That all happened sort of sequentially. So how did I meet with Danny? Danny was, first of all, he was on the scene. He was part of my social group, along with Jay and a few other people, and eventually the names on the back of the records that we went out with. He actually introduced me to that group of friends. And me and Danny would go out. We would go out with a guy called Chris Lowthorpe and Jeremy Dye, and we had this crazy thing where we would always go out in the maddest clothes we could find. Chris would go to second-hand shops and buy the most ridiculous suits you've ever seen, the sort of stuff that your granddad would throw away. He would buy them and wear them to nightclubs. Danny would wear jazz clothes, like he had leather shoes and spats and waistcoats, and he looked amazing. And we used to go to Camden like every Sunday, and there's a designer down on Camden Market who made these black clothes with silver squares on and mad sort of Norman symbols on. And I wore all his clothes. So the four of us, and Jerry Dye just looked cool anyway, so the four of us would go to clubs looking ridiculous. And of course, because we stood out, you know, people paying us more attention. But ultimately, Danny was part of my clique, and one day I just decided the setup I had was absolutely rubbish. What I needed was an Akai S1000 sampler. The Akai S1000 sampler was £2,700 back in 1990, which was roughly 10% of the value of my two-terrace house. So this was a lot of money. I mean, it took him, I got a loan out in my name, but he paid it back, and it took us 2 years to pay that money off. So Danny came into the group because really I needed the Akai S1000 sampler. The year that I hooked up with Danny was probably 1990. However, house music entered my life in '86. There was a number of notable things. One of them, a UK company called Champion was released in 12 inches. And these were great. This was, you know, Jack the Groove and stuff like that. Those original old school tunes came out in Champion. At the same time, there was Rob Olson's Chicago Jackbeat, which was so raw, such a raw sound. I didn't like all the tunes, but it almost seemed an affront that someone could get away with making tunes that raw. You know, it engaged me so much. And then there was double albums called Chicago House and Chicago House Tour that had all Marshall Jefferson, Adonis, Finger Zinc, Jack and Chill. Incidentally, I met all these people. They had a UK tour in 1986 in Great Yarmouth at Tiffany's, and I've got all these people's signatures on the cardboard that held the t-shirt that I brought from the event. So I literally have Adonis, Jack and Chill, Marshall Jefferson's signatures from 1986. So that's how house really entered. But obviously the UK people took house and said, why hasn't it got a breakbeat in it? And that's how we did really sort of the start of UK hardcore. Where did UK hardcore start for me? Well, it was the parties and the music. I mean, I was buying the records, I was DJing. The first DJ job I had was for a guy called Alakos Fakas, who ran Dance Paradise. He's still a good friend to me now. In fact, he was in my first breakdance crew, along with DJ Ritchie, who worked with J&J and Ritchie. But hardcore started really from the techno sound that came from Europe and a little bit the States. The States gave us the 4/4. Belgium in particular gave us these crazy synthesizers. We called it Belgium New Beat back then. And then the UK just took all that. They took all that and they said, it just needs a breakbeat and some rap lyrics, hip hop sounds. So for hardcore for me, evolved out of all the melting pot of sounds that we had at that time. And plus, you know, we were going out. I mean, I was going to Case the Soul weekends. I was going to these house parties. We were travelling around a little bit. I didn't exactly catch the very start of the rave scene because I kind of stayed back from the chemical culture that went with it. It deterred me slightly, only for a few years. But that was a hindrance. But I did go around there, and so there were all these sounds, and you were hearing soul music along with hip hop, along with this early house. The DJs were playing these records sequentially, so it only seemed naturally you'd start to take the sounds together. And that made hardcore. The very first record that defined for me what UK rave should be was a record by a group called Rhythm Section. Rhythm Section, massive influence, not just a massive influence, blatant plagiarism from Hyperon. The ideas, the formula, the structure. Rhythm Section were LSD, Rennie Pilgrim and Swanee. I saw them live a number of times. In fact, they'd blown me away live. In particular, the song that encapsulated everything that defined hardcore was a track called Feel the Rhythm off the EP Coming On Strong. It had a synth pad played in the rave, the traditional rave pattern. It had break beats, it had sub bass, it had little vocal samples, it had little hip hop samples. It was the whole package. And for me, every time I heard that record, even when I hear it today, I have to dance. It really, it defined UK hardcore for me. And really was the stepping stone for Hyperon to move forward. Other influences weren't as heavy as that. I mean, that was a moment for me here in Rhythm Section. But of course, there was everything. Just prior to when UK hardcore started, we had Italian house. House was just starting to get its pigeonholes because there was a moment when it was just called house. And then they had singing, and then they called the house with singing in deep house. And then, so all these sounds kind of followed on one after the other, and they all became a melting pot of one sound house. So there was a lot of different house. So we had Italian house, original house, and deep house, and then the sound of techno. But no, there isn't. I struggle to think of a particular track outside of the Rhythm Section tune because it was all just one thing. Very few things had style. I mean, it was either, if you take those influences of house, let's think about house. How did house start? It started with pianos, the Marshall Jefferson sound. Okay, so that's traditional house. And then there was the techno sound. Well, New York the Americans didn't do that so well, but the Europeans really did. They put techno in. So we had that. So no, there isn't another single record. However, the first one to put the sounds together was the Rhythm Section tune, and that's really when it made sense for me, and everything else kind of went forward from there. The live acts in the drum and bass scene, or in the rave scene, it's because it was present in the clubs that we went to. When we went to the raves, they'd have the live acts. They'd have, Guru Josh. They'd have, obviously you had your Damsky and your 808 State, and also there was Alternate, Audio One. He was right there at the start. Enjoy, who were just like the dons. So it just seemed if you were going to do UK hardcore, you did it live, because that's how it was presented to me. All the parties that I went to had the live acts on, and that didn't. Oh, and obviously the Prodigy as well. You can't forget them because they were there at the start. So for me, I saw it happen. I saw they did it on stage. I made the assumption that's how you did it. Trying to find out the information on making music back in the late 80s, early 90s was impossible. There was no internet. It was pre-internet. There were no books telling you how to make dance music because dance music was making itself. There were no schools teaching you how to do this. And if they were probably the equivalent now of 15 to 20 grand a year to get on them courses. So forget about that. You know, my house cost 28.5 grand back then. There's no way I was spending that. So there was no information. You made it up, you had to discover it all on your own, and no one told you. There were no books, no nothing. So I would ask people. I would ask some people, you know. And one time, after I'd seen Enjoy played for, I think it was Dance Paradise at Tiffany's in Great Yarmouth, back in the early 90s. And Enjoy were brilliant, full stop brilliant. Their ideas, their riffs were amazing. And they influenced Hyperon, of course. And after one of their sets, I went up to them, you know, I was like a keen little fresh-faced skinny kid, and I said, excuse me, can you tell me what equipment you're using? And the guy blatantly said to me, I can't tell you. And he organised the packing up of all the gear right in front of me. Well, they all shot with dirty looks. That really upset me. That makes no sense. It makes no sense to me because if I had all Enjoy's equipment, I would not make Enjoy's tune. I would not be competition for Enjoy. It makes no difference. The same way, if I gave you all my samples, you wouldn't make Hyperon tunes or Easy Rollers tunes. You would make your tunes with my samples. It makes no difference what you tell me about what you do because I am not competition for you. And they did that, and that kind of broke my heart. Here are my heroes telling me they can't tell me how. So yeah, that disappointed me. How did we start making Hyperon tunes? Well, obviously Danny got involved. Me and Danny. Danny's a character. He's a very lively. He's so much fun to go out with. He's the life and soul of the party. This guy's amazing. Always smiles. In fact, a friend of mine calls him the boy with a Scooby-Doo face. He's got this big old smile on him. Danny exclaims everything. He always talks with 3 exclamation marks. He's an incredible guy. He's no matter what we do, he'll shout it. And we've got, yeah, we're going to do that. Yeah, yeah. And it'll be always like this. So the Hyperon tunes started by us constantly sampling, coming up with the most insane samples, putting them all together, while Danny constantly shouted and rocked around the studio. And that's how Danny and I started. It was a voyage of discovery of sounds and new ideas, with no prerequisite to where they were going. Now when I start music, I don't start music unless I have an idea. But that then, we just made tunes with no idea of where they were going. This is prevalent in the Hyperon tunes because they change from start to finish. The first studio I had with Danny was in my landlady's shed. Now, to call it a shed was a little bit optimistic because not all the panels actually met. So the wind would blatantly blow through this thing. It was quite a big shed. It wasn't like something when you put your lawnmower in. It was a reasonable size. You probably could have got a car in there quite comfortably. But it was full of absolute shite and nonsense and crap and stuff that old ladies keep for a long time, as well as Akai's and sequencers and synthesizers and me and Danny. And so that was our first studio. It wasn't very good. Like I say, it was cold, and no matter what you heated, the wind just blew through it. And my landlady didn't like it, and eventually I managed to convince my youngest sister, who had my father's house in the centre of Beccles. He had moved back to Spain and I'd stayed in Beccles, to let us use her outhouse, which was full of my dad's rubbish. There was a 1.5 ton fabric press in there. I mean, it was huge, and it took like 6 of us to move it to one end, and we just dumped everything on it to make this space to put a few keyboards. And that was the shed. That was the shed at the bottom of the garden. It was originally, my sister lived there, and when she moved out, I bought the house. The first studio was my landlady's shed, which was awful. And then ultimately it became the house that I bought off my father, which was the shed at the bottom of the garden.